Hello everyone. Today inshallah we are going to start with chapter number 17, process costing. Of course we discussed process costing in Cost Accounting 1 when we encountered the chapter that discussed job costing. And in that time we differentiated among the two concepts, the process costing and the job costing. Who would like to remind us what is the difference between job costing and process costing? And what do we mean by process costing? Which is the title and the main idea of chapter number 17. So what is the difference between job costing, what we took in Cost Accounting 1, and process costing that we are going or that we are about to discuss? What are the differences? Yes?
Job costing consists of distinct amounts of products and services, but the process costing masses of similar products or services.
Excellent, excellent. Therefore, a job costing system is a costing system that is related to a manufacturing process that produces distinctive, special units. That means these units of output, or each unit of output, has a different specialty, have different specifications than the other unit. Therefore, each unit within a job costing system has or have distinctive processes, have distinctive features, have distinctive specifics that differs from one unit to another. This is this was the definition of job costing that we took in Cost Accounting 1. And at the same time, we also defined the process costing by saying that the process costing system is a system that relates or that is related to a manufacturing or a production system that produces mass production of similar units. All the units that are produced within this manufacturing process are identical in the specifications, are identical in every way. Correct? This was the definition, or this was the distinction between job costing and process costing. Of course, as we said in Cost Accounting 1, the best way to think of job costing and process costing is to think of these two as two ends of a continuum. We have on one end the job costing system, and on the other end we have the process costing system. Of course, as we can see here, the job costing system produces or is related to a manufacturing process that produces distinct, identifiable units of a product or service, while as on the other end of the continuum, the process costing system, which is related to a manufacturing process or a production process that is related or that produces or manufactures masses of identical or similar units of a product or service. Of course, as an example here, custom-made machines. This is one of the processes or one of the manufacturing processes that needs job costing systems. Why? Because each machine, as the example says here, custom-made machines, which means that each machine has different features than the other. Each machine has different specifications than the other. Therefore, in this case, or in this manufacturing process, we need to have a job costing system. While as on the other hand, for instance, food as a manufacturing process or as a production process, producing food would produce the same identical product at the end of the production process. Therefore, all the products within this system or within this production system would have identical outputs or physical units at the end of this process. Therefore, these two are the two extremes in any manufacturing process, but of course, we need to understand a quite important thing, that some of the organizations have a blend between these two systems. It does not mean that an organization should only have a job costing system or a process costing system. It could have a degree between the two. Any questions? Of course, these systems are called hybrid systems. What do you mean by hybrid systems? They have some of the characteristics of job costing systems and other characteristics of a process costing system. Yani, for instance, the manufacturing of cola, for instance, or Coca-Cola. The manufacturing of the Coca-Cola, or let us say for the Coke company, which produces more than one product. It produces Coca-Cola, it produces, let us say, Fanta, it produces Sprite, and so on. In the Coke company, they designate that each product by itself is a process costing system, because each Coca-Cola or each Fanta or each unit of Fanta or each unit of Sprite have the same identical features. We do not have any differences between one unit of Coca-Cola and another unit of Coca-Cola, right? But we have different specifications from the Coca-Cola and, for instance, the Sprite, and, for instance, the Fanta. Therefore, they recognize each product or product line as a process costing system, and they consider all the products within the organization or that are produced within the organization to have different jobs. Therefore, the Coca-Cola product line is considered a job. Let us say the Fanta product line is considered a job, and the Sprite, on the other hand, is considered another job. Therefore, as we can see here, the organization might have a blend or a mix or a hybrid system between these two different systems. Of course, as we took in Cost Accounting 1, we said in order to calculate the costs of production and calculate the costs of the ending, of course, completed work or let us say the finished goods, and to calculate the cost of the work in process, we need to have the job costing system for this type of manufacturing organization. Why is that so? Why do we need, if the organization produces distinct, or let us say identifiable, different products, or each product is different from the other, have different specifications from the other, why do we need to have a job costing system? Or by what way we are going to calculate the costs of the ending work in process and the finished goods at the end of a specific period? Cost Accounting 1. We took this in details in Cost Accounting 1. Yes.
Because you said it's not identical, or it's not like ongoing process that will produce the same ununique.
Excellent.
Product.
So, if the manufacturing process produces products that are different in their specifications, that are different in their manufacturing process itself, it means that each product would consume a different amount of costs, correct? Therefore, if each product consumes different amounts of cost, therefore we need to identify that the costs for a specific job are the costs only for this specific job. We could not use an averaging method. We could not say that we have incurred, for instance, in January, $100,000 in manufacturing costs, and we have produced, for instance, 100,000 products or 100,000 units, therefore the cost of one unit is $1. This averaging method could not be used. Why? Because the first unit is different than the 10th unit, is different than the 1,000th unit, is different than the 100,000th unit. Therefore, this difference between the different units would not enable us to use an averaging method. And as we saw in job costing, we, let us say, directed and traced the costs of each job to a specific job. Of course, as we took in Cost Accounting 1, we used to debit the work in process that is related to the specific job, correct? Therefore, we have traced and allocated the costs to the specific jobs that are within our organization. But on the other hand, in the process costing system, each product is identical. Each product has consumed the same amount of cost. Of course, this is the assumption, because we have the same product, the same specifications of the product, the same manufacturing process for each and every product. That means that each and every product consumed the same cost as the other product. For instance, the Coca-Cola, for instance, if we took the can of a Coca-Cola, this Coca-Cola can took the same or consumed the same direct materials as the other unit, consumed the same direct labor as the other unit, consumed the same manufacturing overhead as the other units. Why? Because all units are identical. Therefore, in the process costing, we could use the averaging method. We could divide the total costs that were incurred within a specific period by the number of units produced within the same period. This is the difference between the job costing system and the process costing system. Of course, as we said, now we are going to consider in details the process costing system and what are the steps in order to calculate the costs of the work in process or the ending work in process and the cost of the finished goods at the end of a specific period. Of course, in the job costing, we took how to calculate the finished goods or the cost of the finished goods at the end of a specific period, and we also took how to calculate the cost of the work in process at the end of a specific period. Now let us take the other end of the continuum, which is the process costing. Any questions? Of course, all this information was taken in details in Cost Accounting 1. Let us take an example of Pacific Electronics. In this example of Pacific Electronics, we are going to consider two different departments. As we can see here, we have an assembly department and another department, which is the testing department. After the manufacture is finished, or the manufacturing process or the production process is finished from the assembly department, the products are transferred to the testing department in order to be further processed. Therefore, the Pacific Electronics have two different departments. The first is the assembly department. The second is the testing department. Of course, our example will focus upon the assembly department and how we are going to calculate the cost of this department. Of course, according to the Pacific Electronics illustration or example, we have only one product. We are going to focus upon only one product, which is the SG40. Of course, the SG40 is produced in an identical manner. That means that the first unit is the same as the fifth unit, is the same as the 10th unit, is the same as the 100th unit, and so on. Therefore, in this case, we are going to consider that we are going to use a process costing system in order to allocate or in order to trace the cost of the SG40. Of course, the first step in any process costing system is that we need to categorize our costs. The first thing that we need to understand in a process costing system, the categorization of costs. Of course, we took in Cost Accounting 1 in chapter number 2, what are the different classifications of costs, correct? Whether they are direct or indirect, whether they are variable, fixed, or mixed, and so on. Therefore, in a process costing system, we are going to categorize according to a new category. We are not going to categorize the cost as direct or indirect. We are not going to categorize cost as variable or fixed or mixed. We are going to categorize the cost according to when these costs are introduced in the manufacturing process. Therefore, the categorization of costs here depends on the question, when do we add up these costs into the manufacturing process? According to our illustration, according to our example of Pacific Electronics, they said that the direct materials are added at the beginning of the process. Therefore, this is the first category. And the second category, which are conversion costs, which are added evenly during the process. Therefore, as we can see here, we have only two different categories of costs. One as the direct materials and the other as the conversion costs. Why we only have two categories? Because the direct materials are added at the beginning of the process, while as the conversion costs are added evenly during the manufacturing process. Any questions? Of course, let us say, for instance, that we have two different types of direct materials. One direct material, or let us say direct material A, and direct material B. Direct material A is added at the beginning of the process, while as direct material B is added, let us say, at 70% of the process or the manufacturing process. In this case, we do not have only one category of direct materials. In this case, we would have two different, from the direct materials perspective. Of course, we would have three. Two according to the direct materials. One would be the direct material A, which would be added at the beginning, and the second would be direct material B, which is added at the 70% point of the manufacturing process. This is another category. And we would have a third category of the conversion cost that would be added evenly according to the added evenly throughout the manufacturing process. Therefore, an important point is that, first of all, in order to use the process costing system, we need to understand that we need to categorize the costs according to when they are added up or when they are introduced into the manufacturing process or the production process. According to our example, now let us go back to our example. We have two categories. The first is the direct materials, which are added up at the beginning or at the start of the production process, while as the conversion costs are added evenly throughout the production process. What is the conversion costs? Of course, we took in cost accounting 1 that we have two different categories of costs. We have the prime cost and we have the conversion cost. What is the definition of a conversion cost? All manufacturing costs?
That can be based on
these are the prime costs, not the conversion. The direct labor and the manufacturing overhead. Therefore, according to our assumption, according to our illustration, yes?
Any cost that appear to convert direct
Excellent.
material from direct material
From raw materials to the finished goods. Excellent, excellent. Therefore, the conversion cost would be, in this case, direct labor and the manufacturing overhead. According to this case, or according to this illustration or example, the direct labor and the manufacturing overhead are added or are used up evenly within the manufacturing process. Any questions? Of course, this is the information according to our example. Now, let us consider different cases that we are going to illustrate upon. We will consider three different cases. Of course, case number 1 would be the easiest. Case number 3 would be the most difficult. Of course, we are going to move on from a simple system to a much more complicated system. as we go along the different cases. Today, inshallah, we are going to consider case number 1 and case number 2. Case number 1 assumes that we would not have any beginning inventory, as in work in process, of course, and we would not have any ending inventory as work in process. Of course, the case number 2 complicates part of the manufacturing process by not having any beginning inventory, but having some ending work in process inventory. Of course, case number 3 would consider that we would have a beginning and ending work in process inventory. Let us start with case number 1. According to our case, or case number 1, this is the data for the assembly department. As we said, we are going to focus our cases upon the assembly department. This is the data for the assembly department for January 2012, for the month of January, which are as follows. Of course, we have physical units for January 2012. We would not have any beginning inventory, according to our assumption, 0 units. The started during January, which means that the units that are started within the assembly department in January 2012 are 400 units. And according to the example, all the 400 units that were started during January were finished from the production process. Therefore, the completed and transferred out, what do you mean by transfer out? Transferred out from the assembly department to the testing department, correct? Therefore, the completed and transferred out are the same 400 units. That means that all the started units within January were completed at the end of January. That means that the work in process ending inventory would equal to 0. This is the data from the point of view of the assembly department. Of course, what do we mean by physical units, first of all? The physical units refers to the output units, whether they are completed or not completed, whether they are finished goods or work in process. Of course, in this case, in case number 1, the physical units here are the 400 units, as we can see here, which are all completed. Of course, if we have any output that is within the work in process or the unfinished work in process at the end of the year, it would be considered also as physical units. Therefore, what do we mean by physical units? The physical units are the number of units within the finished goods inventory and the work in process ending inventory. Of course, now, after this data, they gave us the information regarding the costs that were incurred within the manufacturing process in January. Let us see what was the costs like in January 2012. As we can see here, we have direct material costs which are added during January, $32,000. And the conversion costs that are added also in January, $24,000. Therefore, the total costs that were added in January in the assembly department would equal $56,000, which is 32 plus the 24,000. Now, you as cost accountants, you have the knowledge of the number of units that was started and completed at the end of the period, and you have the knowledge of the costs that were incurred within the period. So, if we need now to calculate the costs of the finished goods, of course, we do not have any ending work in process. Therefore, the only costs that we need to calculate in this case are the costs of the finished goods at the end of January. Correct? So what are the costs per unit for the 400 units that were completed at the end of January? What do you think? So, excellent. In order to calculate the cost per unit, we will divide. Simply, we would use an average, or we would use an average method. We would divide the costs by the total number of units that were produced. Correct? Which is the same concept that we considered when we differentiated among the process costing and the job costing. As we can see here, the direct materials cost per unit would be 32,000 divided by 400 units, $80. The conversion cost per unit would be 24,000 divided by 400, which is $60. And for the total, of course, we either add the 80 and the $60 in order to get the 140, or we could add or divide, the 56,000 by the 400 units, we would have also the $140. Therefore, this is the most simple case, this is the most simple scenario that would be encountered in process costing, because we do not have any beginning and we do not have any ending inventory. Of course, this case is a lot like the case of a service sector. Of course, we all know that a service sector, if most of all, if it starts a process or if it starts, let us say, a production of a service, it ends at the same time, correct? Therefore, the service sector would always have, or would most definitely have, the same case here. It would not have any beginning work in process. It would not have any ending work in process. Therefore, for instance, for a bank, we would divide the cost by the number of units or the number of services that were rendered within a specific period of time. Of course, let us now continue with case number 2. Let us complicate the case a little bit. Let us consider now that we have an ending work in process. An ending work in process, not a beginning work in process. Let us consider case number 2. Yes? It could have, but most... It could have. And we are not saying that all the services would be finished at the end of, let us say, the period, but let us say it is most likely to happen.
What else could have in a service sector?
Let us say that not only service sectors, maybe manufacturing processes could have no beginning or no ending work in process. Let us take the instance of just-in-time process. Do you understand the just-in-time process? Therefore, the just-in-time process, let us say it would have a higher probability to have finished the goods or let us say the processes before the end of the period. If it had, let us say, the beginning or the ending, we are going to consider the case for that instance. But now for our cases, in order to understand what we are or what we need to do in a process costing system, we are going to consider the 3 cases, one without beginning and ending, one with only ending, and one with beginning and ending work in process. But most of all, let us say the service sector is the most likely sector to have the case of case number 1, with no beginning and with no ending. We are not saying that all service sectors would have this case without ending and beginning, but this is the most likely scenario to be in a service sector. Now let us consider case number 2. Case number 2 also considers the assembly department. Also considers the assembly department, but not for January, for February. Therefore, as we saw in case number 1, we ended the month January without any ending work in process. Therefore, we are going to start with month number 2 or February without no beginning inventory. Therefore, as we can see here, the work in process beginning inventory in February 1 for the assembly department is 0. According to the illustration or the example, we have started during February in the assembly department another 400 units. We have completed 175 and we have 225 units still in production, unfinished products, which means we have an ending work in process by the number or by the amount of 225 units. This is according to our illustration. Now let us consider the costs. The total costs that are added during February. Of course, now we need to calculate two things. We need to calculate the costs per unit of the finished goods, the 100% finished goods, and we also need to calculate the cost of the work in process or the ending work in process or the unit per the 225 units. They gave us the information of cost. They told us that the total cost added during February, according to the direct materials, 32,000, and according to the conversion cost, 18,600, with a total of 50,600. The question here, could we use the same method that we have used before in case number 1? Could we divide the $32,000 by the 400 units and the 18,600 by the 400 units, which means the 50,600 by the 400 units? Why not?
In the direct material we can add the total cost, but in the conversion cost we have versus 60%. And we have the work in process changing everything.
Excellent. Excellent. Yes, anyone else?
Maybe we could do that, but we must deduct for the ending inventory that we didn't finish.
Therefore, the problem that we have is that the 400 units, or we could not use the averaging method using the 400 units. Why? Because the 400 units consist of 175 fully completed and finished units, and 225 units that are not completely finished. Therefore, if we are going to divide the $50,600 by the 400 units, that means we are putting the finished goods in the same league, in the same balance as the unfinished goods. Is this a correct way to calculate our costs? To average the cost onto finished and unfinished goods? Of course not. Why? Because the finished goods have taken all the direct materials they need. They have taken all the conversion costs that they need, while as the unfinished goods, they only have taken the direct materials that they need, but they did not have, or they did not take all the conversion costs that they need. Therefore, we could not divide the total cost here by the number of units of the 400 in order to get the cost per unit. So what is the procedure now in order to calculate the cost per unit for the finished and the work in process ending inventory? What do you think we need to do? Of course, the problem here, again, is that we have units that are completed, 100% or fully completed, and we have units that are not fully completed. Therefore, we could not divide the costs by the total number of units because we have two categories within these units. Therefore, we do not have a common measure. We do not have a common metric, correct? In order to use an averaging method, we need to have a common metric, correct? We either need to divide the total cost by the units that are completed and finished, or we need to divide the total costs by the number of units that have not yet been completed, correct? Because we need to divide our classification onto the two different categories of units, correct? Therefore, we need to calculate a common metric. We need to calculate a common measure that enables us to divide the total cost upon the different number of units in order to calculate the cost for the work in process, that is unfinished goods, and for the finished goods inventory. This common metric is called equivalent units. Therefore, we need to calculate something called equivalent units. This is the common measure or the common metric that we are going to use. Of course, after calculating the equivalent units, we would be able, the equivalent units would be the common metric, would have the same characteristics for the finished and would have the same characteristics for the unfinished. Therefore, we would have this common metric that would be used in order to allocate the total cost onto the different units. Therefore, in order to calculate the costs of the finished goods and the costs of the work in process inventories, we need to go through a 5-step procedure. Of course, these 5 steps would not differ from one case to another. These are the 5 steps that we need to consider in order to allocate the costs or in order to calculate the costs. Step number 1, we need to summarize the flow of physical units of output. Of course, we said that the physical units are the output units, whether they are finished or unfinished. So what do we mean by summarizing the flow of these physical methods? We need to answer 2 questions. Where did these units come from? And where did these units go? We need to answer 2 questions. The origin of these units and where did these units go? And as we can see, or as we are going to see in our case, or case number 2, we had 0 beginning inventory, correct? Therefore, we would not have, or let us say the 400 units were all started within February. Therefore, from where did we get our physical output? From where did we get the 175 and the 225? From the current period, from the units that were started in this specific period, because we do not have any beginning inventory. And we are going to see the steps right away after finishing the 5-step process. Therefore, step number 1, we need to answer 2 questions. Where did they come from, the physical units, and where did they go? Number 2, we need to compute the physical output that we have summarized the flow for. We need to compute the equivalent units, which is the common metric that we have just said, or that we have just, let us say, discussed. For instance, what do you mean by equivalent units? We are going to understand the equivalent units according to a simple illustration. For instance, if we had 50 unfinished units, these 50 unfinished units have taken 70% of conversion costs. Therefore, in order to have a common metric, of course, we all know that the finished goods are goods that have incurred 100% of conversion costs, or taken 100% of conversion costs and taken 100% of direct materials, for instance, correct? Therefore, we need to change this number of unfinished units to a number of finished units in order to have this common metric. Therefore, the finished goods would be finished, taken 100% of conversion costs, and the equivalent units of the 50 units would also be finished. Correct? Why? Because we changed the 50 units of unfinished units into a specific number of units that have finished. So I'm asking you now, what would be the number of units that would have been produced if we incurred the 70% of the 50 units and produced finished goods? Excellent. How did you calculate the 35 units? by 70%. Excellent. Therefore, 50 units multiplied by 70% would equal 35 units. What is the 35 units? These are equivalent units, which means that if we incurred the 70% of conversion costs for the 50 units in order to produce only finished goods, we would have produced 35 units of finished goods. Therefore, the 35 units are the equivalent units of the 50 units that are finished goods and have taken 100% of the conversion costs. Therefore, as we can see here, this is the common metric that we are talking about. Why? Because we have transferred the 50 unfinished units into equivalent 35 units that are presumed finished. Now, if we have this common metric, all the units that are calculated or that we would use in order to divide the costs upon are finished goods, correct? Whether they are 100% finished or whether they are unfinished and we have transferred them into finished goods. Therefore, all the units would be as if they are finished 100% from the direct materials and 100% from the conversion costs. Therefore, this is the definition, this is the meaning, this is the concept of equivalent units. Any questions? Step number 3, we need to summarize the total costs to account for. Of course, we need to understand, we need to know what are the costs that we need to divide the number of equivalent units by, correct? Therefore, we need to know the cost that we need to allocate on the different units that were produced. Because as we took in case number 1, we need to know the cost in order to allocate or in order to calculate the cost per unit, correct? Step number 3 summarizes the total cost that would be divided upon the different units. Of course, in this case, because we do not have any beginning inventory, the total cost to account for is the costs that are incurred within this period. But if we have a beginning inventory, the total cost to account for would be the cost of the beginning inventory and would be the costs that are incurred within this period. In this case, it would be only the costs that are incurred within this period. Step number 4, compute the cost per equivalent unit. Of course, we have calculated the equivalent units, which is the common metric. And now we have the knowledge of the cost that we need to allocate on the different units. Therefore, number 4, we need to divide the cost by the number of units of the equivalent, or the number of the equivalent units, which is the computing the cost per the equivalent unit. Of course, the last thing is the main goal of any processing or the process costing system. Therefore, step number 5, we need to assign costs onto our first category of finished goods, and we need to assign costs to our second category of unfinished goods. Therefore, in any case that has an ending inventory, we need to go through these different 5 steps. Number 1, summarizing the flow. Number 2, computing the output in terms of equivalent units. Number 3, summarizing the total cost to account for. Number 4, computing the cost per equivalent unit. And number 5, we need to assign the total cost to the completed units and to the work in process units. Let us consider our case and see the different steps that are illustrated according to our case, according to the data. Of course, as we saw according to the illustration, that the ending work in process have taken 100% of direct materials. Why? Because according to the illustration, according to the case, we said that the direct materials are added at the beginning of the at the beginning of the production process. Therefore, if these units have started, therefore they would most definitely have 100% of direct materials. Therefore, as we can see here, they gave us the information that the working process had 100% of direct materials, while as they only had 60% of conversion costs. The question here, how did they come up with the 60% of, or as the percentage of completion of the working process in regard of the conversion costs? What do you think they did in order to come up with this percentage?
We will multiply 225 by 60%.
Yes, this is the equivalent units. I'm asking, how did they come up with the 60%? The 60% itself. Yani they are saying that the conversion costs that were incurred by the 225 units is 60% of the conversion costs. How did they come up with this percentage? In order to get the 60%, in order to calculate the 60%, the 60% is not calculated, it is estimated according to the experience of the supervisor of this production process, or let us say the production manager, or the product line supervisor, or the product line, let us say, manager, or the product line supervisor. Therefore, the 60% is an estimated amount. Of course, estimating this amount is difficult. It is not something that is easy to do. Therefore, the estimator of this percentage needs to be someone that have a high level of skill, that have a high level of expertise in order to be able to estimate this percentage in a high or in an accurate manner. Any questions? Of course, we are going to complete, inshallah, our cases the next time. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you, inshallah, Saturday.